monocots and dicots. We'll start out with talking about that, move on to some weed biology and just general biology, and then we'll move into integrated weed management and then the weed control options. So when we're talking about weeds, it's important that we identify what is a monocot versus a dicot. So a monocot has a grass-like appearance. It'll have, if you grab the leaves, it'll have these parallel linear veins on them. If you see here in this here, we have a grass or onion. You can see that they have those linear veins, just like your grass would. They have those fibrous roots, and they don't generally have any secondary growth. As far as for weed control, that's not anything that we really need to worry about, but it's just an important thing to remember. As far as dicots, they have two cotyledons, which are shown here in this graphic, and they generally have a taproot, which is this big root system right here. They'll have one big one, while these ones are the smaller fibrous roots. Another thing about dicots is they'll have these netted major leaf veins. I wanted to give you a brief background. Weed biology began in the 1930s. Since then, there has been a lot of advancements, and weed scientists have determined that a majority of the seeds that we have in our seed bank in the soil come from annual weeds. We have our types of cultivation and tilling can influence what populations of weeds we have. So say, depending upon the time of the year that you do tilling, you may have an influx or inflow of, say, winter or spring, summer annuals based on those seeds in the seed bank or in the soil being disturbed and then allowing to germinate. Because weeds reproduce so rapidly, for example, annuals can produce seeds in one season, they can evolve resistance, which is something that is of a concern, which is why we want to do, say, an integrated weed management approach. Some characteristics of weeds or weedy plants are they adapt to high stress. So if you think about where weeds are typically, if you just out in the wild, if you will, they're in disturbed areas like driveways next to buildings where there's a high disturbance regime. They put a lot of their resources into producing seed. So that's like, they're like, more of me is good, right? So the more seeds they can produce, the better they're doing. And they have typically a short life cycle, and they can put up growth in what seems like overnight. Switching to winter annuals, they germinate in the early fall. They have the same cycle or similar cycle to summer annuals, although the time that they germinate is different. So they're going to germinate in the early fall or say around winter time when it starts to cool down. And then they're actually going to, in some cases, overwinter and kind of go into this dormancy stage. And then in the spring of the following year, actually produce their flowering structures and then die when it starts to warm up in the spring. So the main difference between summer annuals and winter annuals is the time that they germinate. When summer annuals will be in the spring or when it starts getting up to those temperatures, and then winter annuals will be in the fall when it starts to cool down a bit. This image right here is an example of an annual bluegrass, which is a pretty common weed, at least in my yard. And this one right here is a common chickweed. This is a dicot, you can tell because of the netted leaves and the broadleafs there. And then this is a shepherd's purse plant that I wanted to show the fruiting structures. So with these ones, if you can get rid of those fruiting structures, then you can cut back on some of those seed production. One thing about winter annuals is that timing is essential. So typically their season is in the fall to the spring, but that's not always the case. Sometimes in that fall season, they will go through this whole cycle of germinating from a seed, producing vegetative growth, the flowering, and then death. So if you do start to see those fruiting bodies on, say, a shepherd's purse or one of these plants, before they go to seed, trim those off, and you can cut back some of those seeds production there. So now we'll talk about biennials. So biennials, they start one year, produce from seed. They'll produce vegetative growth, which this right here is a musk thistle, and this has some flowers here, so this is probably a second year musk thistle. It will produce this rosette, and that's a common theme with a lot of biennials is they'll produce these rosettes. Typically, most biennials are dicots, but there always are some exceptions in biology. With biennials, the best stage to control them is usually in this rosette stage. and it is actually in the fall rather than in the spring. But spring applications of herbicides they can be effective, although you may need to apply more than one. When it comes to just like the annuals, timing is everything. So if we can hit with like say, if we can get these and dig them out and do some type of management on these at this stage, it's a lot easier to do it than when they've already seeded out. But to continue on with the life cycle, they'll germinate from the seed, have vegetative growth, and then go dormant in that fall winter season. And then once it warms up again, they will start to produce more vegetative growth and then flower and then die. And in this flowering time, of course, they'll produce more seeds. So this here is a musk thistle. This is a specific type that is a biennial. And then we have a mullein, which is also a biennial here. So now moving on to the more interesting types of plants. So perennials, they live for multiple years. So they can be quite a pain to control because they will germinate, produce vegetative growth. They'll flower. They can flower in that season. Typically, they will flower the next season, but they'll flower, they'll go through a dormancy stage, and then they'll do vegetative growth again the next season, and then flower, and then that cycle can just continue on and on. So when we're talking about perennials, they will live for multiple years. But there are two different classes or types of perennials. So we have simple perennials, which are what they call solitary. So what that basically means is like a dandelion, you'll have a dandelion out there and you may have several other ones next to it, but they're not connected under the ground by any type of root system. They just have one tap root themselves. The other type of perennial is a spreading perennial, and they have vegetative reproduction. So what that means is if you get like say, on the other slide, we were talking about biennials as musk thistle. On this one, if you get a Canada thistle and you say till that up, that is going to spread everywhere that one of those little viable pieces of that plant is. So you just want to be really careful if you're using the tilling method to control your weeds, to make sure that you have identified what type of plant you have there, because these spreading perennials will spread those weeds out for you. And typically that's not what you want. The way that they do that is they have stones, which are modified stems, rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, and corms. But it's important to really identify when it comes to any of these types of weeds, what it is so that you know what the best control is. And so that, say, if you want to mow or do something like that, like till, make sure you're not going to exacerbate your problem there. Here are some examples of some simple perennials. We have this curly docks, which is Rumix crispus. We have a broadleaf plantain. We have a dandelion. So these are pretty common in like say disturbed areas or compacted areas. You're going to find plantain a lot. So if you have that, there may be an underlying issue with say like you're in your lawn that you may need to address. Some of the spreading perennials are like say quackgrass. So these would be ones that if you were to go out there and till it, it would not do you any favors. You'd have a bigger problem than you do. Another spreading perennial would be Canada thistle as well, as mentioned on the previous slide. So now I'm going to talk about integrated weed management. So when it comes to weed management, we want to have an integrated approach. So the main thing that's important is identification and then timing of application of either a biological, chemical, or cultural or mechanical control. So tilling may be an option for some of those perennials, but knowing when to do it and how to at the right time and making sure we identify the right plant is important to make sure that would work. To drill down a little bit more on those biological methods, I just wanted to give you some examples. This is not an exhaustive list. They're just some methods that I found. Basically, when it comes to biological controls, though, we rely on natural organisms. So that would be like, say, bringing a goat in a goat or sheep that would get rid of those weeds and graze those weeds for us. In smaller homes and lawns, like if you live in the city, this probably won't be a viable option for you. Really, a lot of the biological methods are going to be if you have like a large landscape, a large area that you could like say implement like an insect or a bioherbicide such as like a fungus or a rust on certain types of plants. The only thing about the biological methods is they're great, but they kind of you have to have a certain setup or have a certain plants to really have those, because research is still going on with those biological methods and there isn't always an easy an easy way to get those types of biological things. Another form of biological control would be competitive exclusion. So say we have some clover and or we have a weed over here, a grassy weed, and we have some clover. That clover is going to effectively grow up and choke out the grassy weed there. It won't allow it to get enough light, so eventually it'll just senesce and die. Moving on to cultural control methods. What this really looks at is the interactions between crops, weeds in the environment. So like what are we going to actually do? Not necessarily physically, but what can we do? Mulching is a good option, a good control method. So putting down, say, grass leaves or, or grass clippings or just tree leaves is a good way to keep and suppress weeds, or to apply, like, say, even a cover crop in some of the space in between our rows in our garden, or to even say after we've collected our crops, apply a cover crop there to keep the ground from being bare. We actually put something there that will effectively add nitrogen and rejuvenate it. Precision fertilization or even precision watering are good options for cultural control. So putting, instead of broadcasting our fertilizer out to all of the plants in our lawn or our garden, putting it just to our crops and making sure we're applying that at the right rate will give our crops a competitive advantage over the weeds there generally. And then another method would be occultation. And this can take 4 to 6 weeks. You apply an opaque cover, so like a tarp or something like that, and then you actually seal that down on the ends. Like, say they have in this image, they have some bags here, some sandbags, and then some like a pallet here. And what that does is it'll effectively choke out, it'll starve the weeds underneath that from light and effectively choke it out as well without by depriving it oxygen. This can take, about 4 to 6 weeks, but if you have a big area that you're wanting to, like, say, start a new garden in, or if you just have a big area that you have a lot of weeds in, or if you just have an area that's, bigger than a couple foot wide, you can put a tarp down or something like that to either choke it out, or you can do solarization, which takes about 6 to 8 weeks to choke out and really burn those weeds. So solarization, you have clear plastic, and the sunlight itself actually like is concentrated on those, and the heat gets really intense in there, and that will effectively sterilize the top or burn the plants down to the ground there. Some mechanical methods would be, the actual physical things to remove the weeds. So things like tilling, mowing the plants down. Mowing, it's really important that we know what type of plant we have. So identification is really important when it comes to any of these methods. Hand pulling. I've done this quite a bit because I have some poplar trees in my front yard, and they just love to go into my flower garden because I, fertilize it and take a little more care than I do in my lawn. And then also hot water treatment. So if you, wanted to boil water on your stove and you had some, say, weeds out on your sidewalk or on your driveway, you could boil some hot water and put that on there, and that would effectively burn it. That'll burn it down to the ground. Depending upon what type of weed it is, that may kill it, or you may have to do several applications, but that's something that's easy to do. And if you don't have very many, that would be an easy way to get rid of some of those in the walks. And then finally, I wanted to talk about chemical control. So the herbicides can be classified by timing of application. There are pre-plant herbicides that are incorporated before planting. These are volatile if not integrated into the actual soil, so that is important. I'm going to cover more of the pre-emergence and the post-emergence. As far as pre-emergence, they are applied to the surface and after planting your plants, or after, like, say, your seeds have germinated, but before weeds have begun to germinate, because a lot of the pre-emergence actually just stops seed germination. So it's important to either have an established plant there already or have your seeds germinated, or you may not get the crops that you're actually trying to grow. You may effectively smother them out there or not allow them to grow with those chemicals. When you apply these, you apply them on the surface, or you integrate them into like an inch or two on the topsoil, really following the label. The label will give you these details, and you water that in, or you allow for natural moisture, and that'll percolate down into your soil, and that'll give you up to like 3 or 4 inches of pre-emergent weed control there. As far as post-emergence, typically they are foliar or say like systemic where you spray it on there and they will be translocated throughout the plants. And these would be after the plants are already up. With these types of chemical control, there is a big difference in temperature when we're applying these. So again, just following the label is going to be really important to tell us when and how we can use these. I'll give you some examples of some of the chemicals that you can use, but there is quite a disparity. Typically, you're going to do your pre-emergence somewhere between like say 45 to 55 degrees, but depending upon the label, and then your post-emergence, you're typically, unless you get like one of the more expensive post-emergence sprays, is going to be upwards of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So this here is a couple examples for selective herbicides. 2,4-D is a pretty common broadleaf. Dicamba is a pretty common broadleaf. Trichoplier is a broadleaf. This one's a little more intense. If you have something that's like a bush or a brush, that'll help control that for you. And then Sethoxydim is a grass killer. So these three are what we would call a dicot herbicide, and this would be a grass herbicide or a monocot herbicide. And then they are selective, so they will not, if you spray Sethoxydim on a dicot, it's more than likely not going to control it. With these non-selectives, like such as glyphosate, which is a really common one, that'll kill pretty much anything if applied at the right rate. And typically we're just using that for spot treatments unless we have a big area that we can control or that we need to control. So some of the best practices for weed control are really to scout and identify weeds early. And if you're unsure about what type of weed you have, there are several ways that you can figure that out on your phone, like Google. If you have a Samsung or an Android phone, Google Glass can get you pretty close to what type of plant it is. On your iPhone, if you take a picture of it, it'll actually come up on there and it'll give you an idea. Those are not always correct, but if you're still kind of unsure and you're not able to identify it, you can reach out to your local extension office and they will be able to either tell you what it is or get you in contact with somebody that knows what it is. When we're doing weed control, we want to integrate all of these different methods. For winter annuals, again, the occultation or solarization in the fall, really, or if you have any that go into that dormant kind of stage and then come back in the spring, that would be a good time to do the solarization and the occultation as it begins to warm up. Cover cropping after that crop has grown, we'll cut back on some of the winter annuals or even mowing those seed heads down. So really, again, identifying those weeds is going to help you be able to control them easier and maybe not even need to apply any herbicides. The pre-emergent herbicides for winter annuals would need to be usually applied in the late summer or the early fall, but they also may in the spring, if it's like kind of a cooler season in the spring, may come back up then too. So doing a spring application would also be effective of say the trifluran, which would control the monocots and the dicots, or the pendimethyl, which would control those as well. And then the dimension is another chemical that will control just the grassy plants. As far as for post-emergence, of course, glyphosate is the non-selective, 2,4-D controls dicots, MCPA. And then for monocots, there is, for winter annuals, there's a sulfylfluran. For weed control in biennials, we have frequent hand weeding is the best way to control these because they have these tap roots, and really the best way to get a grip on these guys is to remove that entire tap root. If you're going to do like say any type of like the best time to get them is that first season where they create those rosettes, or even doing like say a mulching over the top of 3 or 4 inches will help suppress some of those, and even mowing or deadheading them before they can produce any flower heads. And then as far as for chemical control, with biennials, the best time is typically in the fall, but in the spring, they're still going to be there because they kind of pop up fast. Before they start to put out their flower head, if you can do a chemical control of like say dicamba, triclopier, or glyphosate, that would work. With biennials, most biennials are dicots. And then finally, moving on to the weed control for perennials, we have cover cropping. So, really making sure that we don't have any bare spots in our soil, making sure that it's covered is a good way to make sure that perennials don't come in and start living there for several years on end. and as well as mulching, 3 to 4 inches of like leaves or grass clippings, and then also hand weeding. With perennials, just similar to biennials, you want to make sure that you get as much of that root system as you can, because they again produce vegetatively. So any part that you leave, there may be another plant shooting up from that. So these need to be removed from your lawn or garden. You can solarize, so putting down a clear sheet of plastic for about 6 to 8 weeks will work to control those in the spring. And then chemical control, the best time is in the fall. To control perennials in the spring, though, you'll likely have to have multiple applications throughout the year. But every time we can cut back some of those weeds, we're going to have less in the less weeds in our seed bank, and they'll likely have less weeds over time if we start to control those. We can till perennials, but we want to make sure that if we do till them, we don't do it very deep into the soil. We want to do frequent, really like maybe like an inch deep into the soil, because if we integrate that perennial into the soil itself, then every part that's there, will reproduce vegetatively. So this is something I wouldn't recommend if this is like, say, your first year controlling weeds. I would likely try this after your to or second or third year to kind of get a grasp on that, because you might end up with the bigger problem if you try to just till those in there. And with that, that is the end of my presentation.